Welcome, everybody. I am Deborah DeBruin, and I direct the Center for Bioethics here at the University of Minnesota. And I'm really delighted to welcome you today to this sort of special edition of our Ethics Grand Rounds, which we are co-hosting with the university's Human Research Protections Program. And today we're going to focus on lessons from the COVID-19 front lines with humans, subjects, research ethics. Next slide, please, Kayleen. So just a few housekeeping items before I turn it over to the speakers. If you have questions for the speakers today, please put them in the Q&A function. So you'll see at the bottom of your screen a function for question and answers. You can enter questions in the Q&A at any time. We'll monitor them during the talk and we'll address them after all the speakers have presented. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat and our support staff will address those issues with you privately. If you are a biomedical engineering student, please email the center at the email address you see on the screen there, indicating your attendance, and you'll get credit for attendance today. At this point, I'm going to turn things over to the Executive Director of the Human Research Protection Program, Deborah Dykes, and she will moderate our panel discussion today. Debbie?
Oh dear. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, Debbie, sounds great.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. So yeah, good afternoon, everybody. And as Dr. DeBruin pointed out, I'm the Executive Director of the Human Research Protection Program. And I'm really delighted to introduce this session on lessons from the COVID-19 front lines. So it's my observation, and yours perhaps as well, that the pandemic has created many challenges for human research and has placed significant strain on the systems and resources that are required to keep the safety and welfare of research participants our highest collective priority. But at the same time, the pandemic has also provided opportunities to learn and to innovate in ways that are certain to have a lasting impact on the way human research is conducted. So we're lucky today to have four really wonderful speakers who will discuss both the challenges and some of the innovations in response to those challenges. And as Dr. DeBruin pointed out, we will ask you to save your questions for speakers until the end of the last presentation, when we'll open it up to you to get those questions answered. So our first speakers today are Harvey Arbit and Wrenda Teeple. Harvey is the president and the chief executive officer of Arbit Consulting, a firm that provides drug and medical device regulatory strategy and support for industry, academia, and also investigator-initiated clinical research. He's an adjunct professor at the College of Pharmacy at the University of Minnesota, and also at the Albany College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences. Wrenda, who will be co-presenting the presentation, is the Chief Clinical Officer and Director of Regulatory Affairs at Arbit Consulting, and also is a clinical pharmacist at Regents Hospital. She is an adjunct professor at St. Catherine's University and also at the Albany College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences. So with that, I'll welcome Harvey and Wrenda, and you can take it away.
Okay, thank you. I'm just gonna get screen sharing up. Can everyone see the screen okay?
Yep.
Okay, so Harvey, I think you can go ahead and get started.
Good afternoon, everyone. Wrenda and I are going to talk to you about navigating the regulations during the public health emergency. It has been quite a ride. Rather than perhaps a fire truck, there should have been a roller coaster. But we're struggling along. We're doing just fine. So we've got a number of abbreviations here for your reference. We'll be using them during our presentation. If you don't know what they stand for, as we talk about a CBRN, you can go back to this slide and it will start that for you. Okay,
I'll keep.
Brenda?
Yep. So these just a few quick objectives. I'm not going to spend a lot of time individually going through them, but hopefully we can get through the presentation and everybody will be able to do all of this. So understanding the statutory basis upon which EUAs are allowed, we'll cover that briefly. Defining the criteria for issuance for EUAs issued by FDA, so you can get a good handle on what exactly is required for an EUA issuance, and then identify considerations for both investigators and sponsors that are conducting clinical research or manufacturing medical devices under the COVID EUA, comparing some timelines for drug EUA approvals, and then some medical device umbrella EUA timelines, and then understanding deprioritization and termination for EUAs. So just some background, an emergency use authorization, or EUA, in the United States is an authorization granted to the FDA under Section 564 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that allows the use of a drug or medical device prior to approval or clearance. So typically the FDA is not allowed to simply let a company or an investigator use a drug or medical device commercially before it is approved. But the EUA process sort of allows the FDA or gives the FDA authorization to do this. It is not the same as approval or clearance of the drug or medical device in the full statutory meaning. So only while the EUA is in effect is this process allowed, essentially. And it authorizes the FDA to facilitate the availability of an unapproved product or an unapproved use of a product. So we've seen that several times, sort of repurposing drugs or expanding the use of certain diagnostic tests to COVID-specific situations during a declared state of emergency, when certain criteria are met. So the Secretary of the HHS, which essentially overheads the FDA, CDC, and other public health organizations, CMS, will issue an EUA declaration and declare that emergency use authorization by the FDA is appropriate. So that allows the FDA to authorize the unapproved or use of unapproved medical products if 4 requirements are met, which we'll talk about in just a second. So a determination under the Public Health Service Act that a public health emergency exists does not inherently give FDA the authority to issue EUAs. It has to be specifically declared that that is appropriate by the Secretary of the HHS, which did happen for COVID. So the 4 criteria for issuance is that it has to be a CBRN agent, must be capable of causing a serious or life-threatening disease or condition, which SARS-CoV-2 does, obviously. There has to be evidence of effectiveness. So medical products that may be considered are those that may be effective to prevent, diagnose, or treat a serious or life-threatening condition caused by a CBRN agent. So things that the FDA may think could work would fall under what would be appropriate for the EUA authorization. A risk-benefit analysis. So you have to know the potential benefits and then what the potential risks of that product could be when being used to diagnose, prevent, or treat the CBRN agent or the life-threatening or serious condition caused by that agent. So you still have to do a risk-benefit analysis. And there has to be no alternatives. So no adequate, approved, or available alternatives to the candidate product for diagnosing, preventing, or treating the disease or condition. So right now, under the COVID EUA, all of these proposed treatments are essentially considered investigational. So even if one is showing a little bit more promise than another one, neither one of them have been fully approved and would not be considered an alternative treatment, because right now they would all be investigated under an EUA.
Okay, so we list here the categories that the EUAs have been authorized for: vaccines and drugs and biological therapeutic products, as well as in vitro diagnostic products, the personal protective equipment and other related devices, and also ventilators and other types of medical devices. Next slide. So the EUA authorization is separate and distinct from the use of a medical product under the following: an investigational application such as an IND or an IDE, an expanded access like a single patient IND, or emergency use as in an emergency use IND. If the product does not meet the statutory criteria for issuance or is not otherwise an appropriate candidate, an alternative regulatory method may be an appropriate means to provide patients access to an unapproved use of a product in a CBRN emergency. Next slide. One of the things that we learned in working with the FDA during this pandemic is that it's not a one-shot deal. It's a very complex set of circumstances which have to be met. The FDA has issued a number of guidance documents and templates for the SARS-CoV-2 EUAs. There are documents that describe how to request a meeting with the FDA to discuss what your particular drug or device needs are, and an opportunity to get feedback from the FDA either in writing or by a teleconference. Also, the application process, the review process, approval or rejection. There are documents on the FDA's website that give details with regard to those items. There's also an ongoing safety and efficacy review. In other words, real world evidence data collection. So if as something is being used under an EUA and they find that maybe there are more adverse events than they'd like there to be, that is something that will then be taken into consideration to determine whether or not the EUA should be continued. When an EUA is terminated, there is a requirement for product disposition because that product under an EUA, as Wrenda had mentioned earlier, is not a regulatory marketing clearance or approval. It's simply an authorization to use it under this emergency circumstance. And then you can also at the time talk about FDA about the full regulatory statutory approval process, so that if you are going to collect data, you collecting the right kind of data that gives you regulatory utility and could be used towards a marketing application. Next slide. So eventually things do come to an end. When an EUA declaration is terminated, any EUA that's been issued based on that declaration will no longer remain in effect. An EUA declaration will terminate either when circumstances that precipitated the declaration have ceased, or a change in the approval status of the product such that the authorized use of the product is no longer unapproved. So if a drug or device is being used under an EUA and the sponsor of that EUA let's say gets an NDA approved for the drug, or a 510K for a device, or a PMA for a device, then it becomes an approved product and no longer needs an EUA. One of the things that goes along with termination is that the Secretary of HHS must provide advance notice that is sufficient to allow for the disposition of an unapproved product, and any labeling or other information provided related to an unapproved use of an approved product. Next slide. So as we move forward with this, we also notice that FDA has prioritizations, and at this point, I think we're beginning to see EUA deprioritization. And deprioritization by the agency may be due to the volume of EUAs, or a particular EUA may no longer be a priority. There may be adequate supplies available on the market because of the EUAs, and therefore additional EUAs are not necessary, because reviewing an EUA and monitoring an EUA takes up a significant amount of resources from the FDA, and they obviously need to prioritize things so they can get the most important things done first. CDRH, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, usually provides little or no additional information about why a product is not a priority. So we have seen where that has happened, and you ask the FDA for a reason and they simply say it's no longer a priority. Also, CDRH's position is that it cannot continue issuing EUAs if there are adequate alternatives on the market. Not all product categories are treated the same way. Just because maybe the product that you would like to see with an EUA you think is most important, if the agency doesn't agree with that, then I guess the agency, they win. There is little or no or nothing that can be done to challenge the FDA's prioritization decisions. And I guess under the circumstances here, they have to have some rigidity in their procedures, or nothing would get done. And a shift in CDRH's priorities could prevent a product from obtaining an EUA. Okay. So here are 3 examples from the University of Minnesota. The first one that we encountered was hydroxychloroquine, and this a pre-IND was submitted on March 12th, and in 4 days they received, the researcher received a study may proceed letter from the FDA, and we just were ecstatic that the FDA could actually work that quickly. Imagine 4 days from pre-IND to you may start your study. So we went on and we said, okay, our next project is losartan. And we thought 4 days, we can certainly live with 4 days. So on March 16th, we submitted a pre-IND, and we found that a month later, after the FDA had asked us to clarify several points in the protocol and had made some suggestions and asked for some other documentation, we finally were able to submit an IND, and fortunately the responses to the FDA were satisfactory, and the next day we got study may proceed. And then as time went on, 5 months later, we submitted a pre-IND for metformin. And you can see here on the slide, it was over 2 months going back and forth with the FDA, clarifying things, submitting additional information, substantiating things, and so forth, before we could actually file an IND application. Once we did that, as you can see, it took another month before we got a study may proceed letter. So that was 105 days. So you can see things went from 4 days to 105 days. And it's all basically the same thing. We had 3 different drugs, all these drugs are on the market for other uses. So we know that there is a safety history, at least a safety history for why they were approved. Yet the FDA considered each one of those separately and differently, and you can see that the timelines involved in each were significantly different.
Okay, so just for the sake of time, I won't be running through all of these dates and numbers, but this is, you can reference this back if you'd like to. So regarding PPE EUA approvals, the FDA has had several umbrella EUAs that they've issued. And you'll see on the next couple of slides how much it has changed since the beginning of the EUA declaration early of 2020. There have been umbrella EUAs for surgical masks that have had many issued by FDA and a couple removed. And 95 respirators essentially are allowed to be commercially marketed if they're NIOSH approved. Ones that are not NIOSH approved have 2 different templates and EUAs for those manufactured in China, those imported from countries that are not China, both of which have been revised several times throughout the last year. Manufactured in China have seen almost 200 issued and obviously 54 removed. So the FDA is constantly not only updating their process, but also re-reviewing ones that they've already approved to make sure that they're still meeting the updated standards or the updated recommendations that they have for EUA approval. As well, they also have an umbrella EUA for face shields that you can see. And then I just want to touch on the next slide. So IVD EUAs is another example of where the FDA is sort of constantly updated, not only their umbrella EUAs, they've pulled umbrella EUAs for certain types of tests. So for serology tests, April of last year, they had an umbrella EUA and the FDA revoked that in July of last year. They have several templates for test developers that can be used. These are mostly, I would say right now, for commercial direct-to-consumer or test kits, whereas labs that are CLIA approved for moderate or high complexity now I think are going through FDA a lot less, because at the beginning of the pandemic, when the original EUA was issued, the FDA sort of took charge with all laboratory tests, whether they were LDTs done under CLIA labs or whether they were commercial entities doing test kits. The FDA sort of took over, had requirements and umbrella EUAs, and then in August, the HHS issued sort of a rescission of guidances from FDA concerning the pre-market review requirement if they were CLIA labs and were already approved for moderate or high complexity. Several labs have already gone through the process, even though it was no longer a requirement as of August. But the FDA has continued to sort of update what their requirements are. And in the last several months, they've added this tests for management of COVID-19 patients. So obviously, as we've learned more, we've even learned about ways to test for certain markers to manage patients. And those have all been IL-6 based, but that didn't exist at the beginning of the pandemic. So as we learn more, the FDA sort of continues to not only update guidances or templates, but also issue new ones. So just real quick, lessons learned. First, if you're going to go through this EUA process, it's important to have your entire research team ready and available for quick responses and requests for information from FDA, especially if you want that quick turnaround time. FDA did shift their resources significantly to handle that influx in applications, even though obviously as things go on, they reshift and reprioritize. so that there may be some inconsistencies in timelines for reviews and approvals. Research and sponsors should be prepared to work closely with FDA under the entire EUA process until either they obtain a full approval or there's an EUA termination. Regulatory requirements are not significantly different in terms of quality or documentation, but FDA is shifting resources, which impacts timelines. And then there's less information available publicly due to the nature of the approvals. So full approvals get full package inserts, and a lot more of the preclinical and clinical data is made fully public. Because of the EUA, that is not possible. And then sponsors should have a plan for EUA termination early on, because we know it's an emergency use and hopefully the emergency doesn't last forever. So planning for what you're going to do when it is terminated can save a lot of stress and time in the end. And then we'll save questions for the end.
Thanks, Harvey and Wrenda. Our next speaker today is Idali Oliva. Ms. Oliva has over 16 years of experience in healthcare interpreting as a trainer, educator, administrator, as well as having responsibility for vendor management and large-scale language service operations. Currently, as the Director of Language Services at M Health Fairview, Ms. Oliva leads the strategic direction and operations of language services across an integrated system combining Fairview, University of Minnesota, Ebenezer, and Health East. Together, these systems serve the largest limited English proficient and deaf and hard of hearing patient populations in the state of Minnesota. So welcome, Ms. Oliva.
All right, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Thank you for the nice welcoming, and I will go ahead and get started with my presentation. I will be talking today regarding healthcare interpreting through pandemic and beyond, and how the interpreters have been able to pivot to some remote modalities to be able to provide services and engage patients and participants through communication access. So with that, I do have a video clip I'd like to share everyone just for context and to be able to help us dive in the conversation. So I'm going to pause my screen if you want to share the video.
The numbers are staggering. Latinos make up nearly half of all confirmed coronavirus cases in California and nearly a quarter in Illinois. In New York City, more than a third of all COVID-19 victims are Hispanic.
Just close your eyes and put yourself in a country where you don't speak the language.
Amid the pandemic, an efficient meeting with a doctor can be the difference between life or death. But for some Latinos or other groups with limited English skills, that's not always so simple. That's where Gina Padilla Quintanar comes in.
If it weren't for our voices, they wouldn't know what was happening to them. They couldn't understand.
She's been a Spanish interpreter at Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital for 15 years. Many of the COVID-19 patients she helps are low-wage immigrant workers.
Children, moms, dads, grandma, and they're all living in one or two rooms. When they start the interviews, you just realize that they're all sick.
Many hospitals rely on third-party services that provide remote phone or video interpretation. But even on-site interpreters like Padilla Quintanar are increasingly helping patients on the phone.
The human touch, just holding someone's hand or putting your hand on someone's shoulder, you can't do that over the phone.
Some hospitals are still prioritizing in-person interpretation, even for COVID-19 patients.
These patients are so sick and that they cannot really speak at a very loud or even You've got to really listen to be able to hear their voices. And then on top of it, you're doing it through a video iPad that's about 6 feet away from the patient. So the interpreter said, no, we're part of the clinical team. So this is when our patients need us the most.
Carla Fogeren's team of around 100 medical interpreters in 9 Massachusetts hospitals put their own health at risk every day to assist patients who have been isolated from friends and family due to the virus.
They feel like they owe it to the community and they owe it to their clinical colleagues to be present.
Ben Chamisso, Newsy, Chicago.
All right, I'm going to go back to my presentation now here. So that was just a quick video to kind of share how interpreting has taken place during the pandemic time. So with that, I'm going to, can you see my screen now again?
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect, thank you. So I'm assuming that most of you or some of you have interacted with patients or individuals in the community that do not speak the language, what we call limited English proficient. And so it has really been quite the change with the number of people in the US that speak other languages than English at home and in the community before COVID-19 and after COVID-19. It certainly is a matter of life and death at times. And with that, I'm going to try to cover some of the objectives that are listed here on the screen. So talk a little bit about how the pandemic impacted healthcare interpreting, what are the lessons that we learned, what's ahead in the future, and then what's the current system that we are most landing at this time with a hybrid system with remote and on-site modalities, and what's the future ahead again. So here at mHealth Fairview, during COVID-19, we've certainly seen a huge change. Nationally, in-person or face-to-face encounters have dropped significantly. I would say that in the nation, there's been some systems that were ahead in technology, some others that were kind of in the middle, and some that were in the infancy state of utilizing remote services. But in the end, during COVID-19, we all had to really pivot and adjust to an increased demand for remote services. Prior COVID-19, here at mHealth Fairview, 90% of our work was delivered in person. So our interpreters were seen on site at the bedside and or at ambulatory care settings in person, and they'll be just moving throughout the system from place to place. And we were doing everything and anything we could to have somebody on site every single time. After COVID-19, we have changed to a 99% remote modality. So most of our services are currently done right now via video and phone. So having an interpreter on the phone or having a video interpreter, just like we have our Zoom call right now through video. Prior COVID-19, systems like us had not ventured to remote interpreting. And so when this hit, we really had to just quickly adapt, implement, and adjust to remote modalities. This was possible through leveraging our own interpreting staff. We're very blessed to have a large number of interpreters that work in the system, and we're able to really maximize their output by utilizing technology. Prior COVID-19, because again, interpreters were moving from location to location. Some of them were only able to achieve a few sessions a day. We're now with technology where there's no commute or parking or need to be finding a location throughout, huge buildings. Our interpreters are able to connect call after call. And so it really has showed some efficiencies through the technology. So what has been the experience for interpreters and institutions? I think institutions have seen again the interpreter volumes that have were dropped in the beginning of the pandemic. Again, like I shared before, some systems and institutions were not really ready to pivot to this remote modality. And so it was really difficult for them to be able to find space and be able to get the technology rolling for people to either be sitting in a call center and or have a way for their staff to work from home. Some systems also experienced some reductions in staffing with their interpreters. I know that some interpreters also reported in the US that they had issues getting PPE, and therefore they were doing mostly remote modalities. Some institutions also had challenges adapting to the different platforms. So transitioning, from one platform to another, learning the process really caused interruptions in the provider and the patient experience. We also have learned from institutions that most of them did not have any COVID exposure at work while the interpreters were providing face-to-face. As far as interpreters, lots of different changes for people that work as freelancers, so interpreters that do not are not employees of any institution. They really saw a big change in terms of losing work and not having the ability to continue interpreting. As far as staff interpreters, so interpreters that are employees working for institutions, they had to adapt to the use of PPE. Some, again, working remotely, whether it's from a call center, from their residence, through the audio and the video functions. A lot of interpreters went from being a true oral service where they will talk all day long to now learning new platforms. So really learning how to work with computers and how to work with technologies to explore so many different environments like Zoom or Microsoft Teams or Google Meet, WebEx, etc. Interpreters also had experienced the challenges of their dynamics at home with remote school and distance learning and having to share, again, the connectivity with so many people working from home. Something else too that it's important to highlight is that interpreters also live in the communities that experience the high levels of COVID transmission. So they were sharing houses with, other essential workers that, again, live in multi-generational homes and have this extended families, which at times were in reality large pandemic bubbles. So we saw a lot more interpreters getting sick when they were not on site because they were exposed at home, again, through the large extensive family living with them. So currently we are working on this remote interpreting and hybrid model. So what does that mean and how does it work? So we have a variety of staff members that are able to that are cross-trained and are able to provide services in so many different settings. So originally in history, most of the services were, again, in person, having the interpreter on site, face-to-face, right as you can see here on my screen, right in the session with the patient and provider. And this is prior COVID, obviously, these pictures, you see no mask. And then now we're working on this virtual modality, which is, again, the video remote interpreting platform, VRI, and OPI, the over-the-phone interpreting platform. So we have interpreters that are working on the phone and available to provide services on demand 24/7 for over 200 languages. And then on the video remote interpreting platform, we also have services available throughout the system in multiple locations through the use of an iPad. So this is kind of what that hybrid model is, having a combination of services that can meet the patient at different environments with different modalities and settings depending on what the session is about and what the access to technology is and whether or not the patient benefits from the use of technology and or if the patient requires to have somebody on site. So what were the lessons learned through our time here in the pandemic? We realized that internet had a lot of different challenges for different people working remotely. We saw, again, number of people changing to this remote modality. We saw a lot of users connected at the same time. So we realized that it was not such an easy change for interpreters to provide remote services. We also experienced interpreters that had challenges at home providing services due to internet and energy outages. We also learned that staying home for some interpreters did not mean staying safe, again, because they live in extended generational family homes where with other essential workers that perhaps were bringing the virus home. Again, they were living in hot spots or multi-generational homes with essential workers. And then we also had this sort of extended families of larger bubbles with potentials for cultural en masse gatherings that were perceived okay by the community. So what's the future ahead for interpreter services or language access? We think that really it's a kind of a shared responsibility between healthcare institutions, clinical staff providers, and interpreters to be able to work together, adapt, thrive, and move beyond pandemic time. Language access, it's been a topic that should be really at the before that rather than after that. So we think that institutions can work together to refining and enhancing this hybrid model that we currently have, and being able to integrate all of the language access in all of the telehealth platforms. So any program, any institution, any department, any program can have access to interpreters. It really means health equity and equal access when you work with patients that do not speak the language, whether it's limited English speaking proficient patients and or deaf and hard of hearing patients as well. We think that by working together, we can produce a better experience of access to communication for everyone, which in the end is going to have the better outcome for the patient and the goal that we're trying to achieve. We think that interpreters are going to be able to become proficient in all of these modalities. We've seen that in the last year, and we know that that will continue to take place. We know that by partnering with institutions, we're going to be able to, again, enhance the improvements that are needed, because technology has so much more to offer to the language access piece, and we just need to work on that. We also learned that interpreters need to work more on self-care, because that's going to be able to allow them to provide a better service for everyone. And then we also are supporting interpreters to work further in their credentials to be able to achieve national certification in healthcare interpreting, which is the highest credential available in the US. As far as staff and providers, we think that, you know, by having the shared responsibility, we ask that people are flexible and open, they provide feedback, they make sure that they voice their concerns, they engage and ask questions to the family, ask questions to the patients, bring those questions and those concerns forward, and really try to put yourself in the shoes of that non-English speaking patient, and how will that impact your care and your accessibility to research and services. And just kind of work with being a real partner with all of the institutions, the interpreters, again, to be able to provide the best care for the patients. We really think, again, that language access will continue to be fundamental. It really takes a village, and we've seen that during COVID-19 in so many areas of our lives. But I think for patients that do not speak the language, and again, they're disproportionately impacted by COVID, it really needs a partnership and a true shared responsibility. And so I appreciate everyone listening to my presentation today, because you're doing your part by listening to this and providing feedback and asking questions at the end of the session. So with that, I'm going to stop here. I have my contact information to share if anybody has questions that perhaps we won't have time to cover today. This is a quick picture of the interpreters that work here at mHealth Fairview, and just a quick snapshot of the services we provide, the many languages we cover. So just thought I kind of share this as well in the presentation so people can take a look later on. But with that, I'm going to give it back to Kaylee, right? Or Debbie? And I'm going to stop here. So thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Idaly. That was a really, really good talk. Thank you. So our last speaker this afternoon is Abbey Staugaitis. Abbey is the program manager of the Acute Care Research Coordinator Group at the university. And she's also the manager of a couple of large, I believe they're NIH-funded cooperatives studies, I think in neuroscience, but Abbey, you can correct if you'd like. So Abbey also works in the Department of Emergency Medicine, and will be talking to us today about a topic she's really an expert on, which is remote consent. So Abbey, I'll ask you to share your screen and take over.
All right, thank you. All right. Well, thank you for having me today, and I appreciate being here and listening to all the other speakers. So, in addition to the work with some of those NIH-funded SIREN network and StrokeNet, we also did an extensive work in COVID research. So we had done a little bit of work. My group had done a little bit of work with remote consent processes for some of our acute care studies, traumatic brain injury and stroke in particular, but really COVID was the deep dive into what we were capable of, and even where we could go with remote consent processes in the future. So this is just a brief outline of some of the discussion points in this presentation today and things to talk about in the Q&A. So the ALPS COVID study was actually 2 different studies. So it started in March of 2020 as a small pilot study and expanded into 2 multi-center trials, one specific to Minnesota, an outpatient trial for patients who had SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 symptoms but did not need hospitalization, and an inpatient study that included 11 hospital systems across the country and was for patients who were admitted to the hospital with SARS-CoV-2 and COVID symptoms. So these studies were funded. One was funded by MDH, the outpatient study, and the other was by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The outpatient study closed slightly early because we were for futility and at the interim analysis, but we were able to enroll 117 patients. And interestingly, we screened 14,371 patients, which actually plays into a little bit of where we could potentially go with remote consenting and what we learned. Of those 14,371 patients, 3,422 patients we could not enroll because of unavailability for language. So this goes into what our previous speaker was saying. We learned a lot during this COVID pandemic about things that we can improve on for the future for accessibility, and I'll talk about those a little bit later. For the inpatient study, which was losartan versus placebo for patients with COVID-19 symptoms, we actually, I'm happy to report, achieved our end enrollment number in February of 2021. We enrolled 205 subjects after multiple institutions screening over 4,000 patients. And we hope to have publications on both of these studies in the very near future. So to accomplish this, as of when we began enrollment in April of 2020, one of the key things we had to utilize was an eConsent platform, and we did all of this 100% remotely. So both protocols were designed to minimize or have zero contact between researcher and patient due to SARS-CoV-19. And so as you can imagine, this was exceedingly important because for a number of reasons, mainly being risk of exposure. We also had used this previously and used it quite a bit during our COVID research due to location. So people being in different locations at different times. And there's some additional benefits to using eConsent as well, not just decreasing risk of exposure or being able to bridge that gap between locations. There's also, it's a really rapid and efficient way to deliver the correct informed consent documents to someone and have them on hand, so we're not dealing with papers or missing papers. And it really also helped us with sort of optimal documentation. So again, because we're not losing any pages or having to fax things or having outdated forms, we really promoted eConsent and got to use it a lot during SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. This is just a couple screenshots of what our eConsent looked like for the ALPS study and some of the other ones. This is probably pretty familiar to people who are using eConsent now. This is a REDCap platform, and all of the pertinent information is presented via a link that is through a survey in REDCap. This is some of the features that we really like for an eConsent platform. These are radio buttons that help document the relationship potentially of an LAR, or if you are in person or remote. So it's really adaptable to the needs of the consent conversation, the location, and the situation that you're in to utilize eConsent. So this is a screenshot our one of our eConsents. And then this is just showing one of the returned copies. So at the end of an eConsent discussion, and when the eConsent is at the end of a discussion, and when eConsent is signed, it is actually a physical signature that we're using, and a copy is returned to the LAR or patient if they would like to get one by email. We're also able to print out a copy at the end, and this is just an example of what that looks like. So this is a schematic of the kind of overall process that we use for remote consenting in our ALPS COVID studies, and also in some of our other tier 1 studies. We were able to open a couple others as well during the shutdown and operate them remotely utilizing remote consenting and an eConsent. So a potential patient was identified by the treating team or on a list, and we were able to send out information to them via eConsent. So usually that started with a phone call, introduction, explaining the process and what we were doing, and then initiating connecting with them via email or text to send over a link for the eConsent. Once we confirmed that they had that eConsent in front of them, then we could initiate the consent discussion. And as you would face-to-face, ideally, and continue on through all the required elements of consent and signature sections. Upon completion, the research team, once it's returned and submitted, the research team can then see the eConsent, verify the information in there, and it's secured solely in REDCap. The study team reviews it for accuracy, and then we can go on to randomization and treatment. All right, so some of the practical issues were accessibility. As I mentioned, a number of patients that we screened spoke English or did not speak English as their primary language, and I think that was a barrier at our institution and other institutions as well. There's also a lack of technology and internet sometimes, not just out in the community, although that is an issue also within the hospital. So patients either don't have connectivity on the devices they brought, or they don't have devices available to them in the hospital. And that was one of some of the issues that we ran into. We also had to really learn how to thoughtfully introduce the research studies, and we are still working on that. Working in telemedicine and remotely is a very different dynamic than in person. You don't have the natural walking into the room and introducing yourself. It does take more thought, and there's a different type of learning for how to connect with people remotely, how to bring the research into the context of their care or why you're contacting them. And then also, gauging feedback. So there's, without sometimes a video connection, there is the lack of nonverbal communication that helps, guide consent discussions and that back and forth understanding. So kind of assessing understanding in those nonverbal cues. And then we also have still run into some formatting issues. Consents are very lengthy sometimes, and so navigating and they're text dense. When you're in person, you can go through different elements and really have that discussion guided in that face-to-face interaction, and it's a little bit different when you're using remote processes. So we had to really look at the formatting and how to have things make sense. A lot of the REDCap, the way that the REDCap program is written, some of the external automated features are written in English. So that was one of the things that really came to light when we started using it more and more throughout 2020 for our COVID research. All right, so these are some of the ways that we hope we can, some of the things that we've learned, and some of the ways we really hope we can expand upon this technology and this process improvement beyond the pandemic and into the future, taking some of the lessons that we've learned and using it and really take it to the next level. I think we've started to figure out how to bridge that gap between space and access people and institutions much outside of the Twin Cities area and outside of the hospital setting, but only partially. So we've started the process, but there really is a long way to go. And these are some of the key things that I think we could think about for future improvements to both the eConsent platform and also the process of remote consenting and doing research work in a more remote environment. So a few things that our group has discussed is having the hospitals be more internet capable. I know a lot of the other COVID researchers ran into this issue as well. So there is internet available, but it maybe isn't available inside a patient's room, or the devices don't connect to an outside, to the internet. So improving accessibility, if we're going to expand upon remote processes, making the technology more accessible to more people. And then, as we discussed quite a bit, having languages, and not just in straight interpretations of the consent, but also in how the platforms are set up. So any outgoing messages would be in a language that someone could understand, setting up sessions with interpreters, and really making the entire process understandable to someone rather than just a straight translation of the consent form. Looking at it from a user's endpoint and how to make it the most accessible. One of the things that we'll have to really improve upon, I think, and we've just started, is how to keep that human element while expanding our research reach. So using telemedicine the way you interact on telemedicine screens is different than you might interact in person, and there is a learning curve to that. So if we as researchers and nurses and doctors and interpreters and everyone learn how to use the technology better, then we're focused less on the technology and more on the interaction. So there is, I think, work to be done in learning how to use remote technologies, telemedicine and video even being one of them, and how that's a different approach to consent conversations. As I mentioned, it's different introduction that you would have when you're in a remote setting than you would have face-to-face. And so those are very different, and learning how to do both well is really important. At the end of the day, we really want to keep the focus on the patient and the content, at least for research, the content of the study, the content of the consent conversation, and have the focus be less about connectivity issues, tech issues, or formatting issues, and really make it, improving the connection between people, even if they aren't physically in the same place. And that leads to my final point for potential future directions for remote and eConsent platforms for research is to reconsider the structure. If it is screen-based instead of paper-based, how might that be different for conducting a consent conversation? There's a lot of multimodal capabilities that we would have access to beyond paper. So maybe rethinking how things are presented in video format, in audio format, being able to increase the text size or use pictures or diagrams, or even having verbal explanations in different volume levels for people who may be hard of hearing, might be some of the things that we could think about for future directions for remote consenting and also for eConsent technologies. All right, and with that, this is my contact information. Thank you for inviting me today. We really appreciated it, and I will pass it back for the question and answer section.
Thanks so much, Abbey. So, and thanks to the audience, there have been questions coming in, which I want to launch right into to make the best use of the time we have left. So the first question that I have is for Harvey and Wrenda. And the question is, the FDA has issued a lot of guidance during the pandemic. Do you think they will retract or go back to sort of pre-pandemic guidance, or consider the guidance more permanently?
Well, let me see if I can start to answer that, and Wrenda, you can jump in anytime you'd like. The FDA has issued a number of guidance documents which are specific to EUA. And so when this pandemic is over, those guidance documents will probably still remain there, but they'll probably be inactive. Actually, a lot of EUAs stay active for quite a long time, even though there may not be any devices or drugs out there that are being used under the EUA. At some point, the products that are being used under an EUA will eventually become lawfully marketed, because when the EUA is terminated, those products can no longer be distributed. So it's the procedures are specific to EUA.
The one thing I will say, now this isn't a guidance that FDA issued, but they've had several changes in that area recently and through COVID, is the LDT IVD space. The statement from the HHS regarding the pre-market review requirement for LDTs was not specific to COVID necessarily. So that I can see either sticking. Now the Secretary of HHS is different now than it was last August, given the change in administrations. So I could see that sort of approach towards what's within the FDA's jurisdiction and what the FDA can require of laboratories. I can see either that staying or the new secretary sort of going back on that statement and saying, no, that's not how this administration's approaching it. And labs do still need to go through FDA for pre-market review of certain LDTs, like FDA was requiring for COVID LDTs. So I can see that going either way, and I think it's independent of the EUA process. But I do think a lot has come out of the FDA sort of shifting resources towards really developing some of those templates, and some of the content of those guidance documents I think will stick around, and I think will be incorporated into maybe updating some other guidance documents that they have that haven't been updated in a while. I don't think they'll want to duplicate those efforts. So I do think some of it could stick around, but once the EUA is terminated, like those specific guidance documents won't necessarily still be relevant or be able to be used.
Thanks, thanks, Harvey and Wrenda. The next question is for Idly. How or what can researchers do to help make an interpretation encounter more successful?
That's a great question, and thanks for bringing that up. I think it's very important to be able to provide as much information as possible to the interpreter and the patient ahead of time, if that's a possibility. I think there's regardless of the language research, it probably will be new for most patients unless they come prepared for that when they come to the US, or even if you have local families here. So I think it's great to see the interpreter as your partner as you deliver the message and provide the information to the patient. We interpreters are bound by a code of ethics, and we follow some standards of practice. So a lot of the times, as much as we want to sort of help out, we have to stay true to the message. And so I think it's important to ask the interpreter how to improve the communication. Interpreter can provide some tips, but in the end, it really is the information that you share with the patient. I think there's a lot of room for future partnerships to be able to, as I was sharing other presentations, to be able to perhaps develop better language that's easily understood, because that's another challenge we have with the complexity of the terms that are utilized that perhaps have no equivalent in other languages because of the limitation of the languages or if there are newer languages that may not have, again, that vocabulary. So I think there's a lot of work, again, that can be done in a partnership way to be able to facilitate the communication and be able to have the interpreter be prepared ahead of time, and also provide that information to patients in writing in another language if that's possible. But that's a great question. So I would always ask the interpreter for feedback as well, to see if there's any specific cultural nuances that might be helpful when you connect with your patient. But that's a great question. So thank you again. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, thanks, Idaly. Next question is for Abbey. How do you ensure that a potential participant or their legally authorized representative understands when obtaining eConsent, especially in a remote environment where you may not be able to see facial cues that might suggest that they don't understand?
That is a really, that's a good question, and it's something that we're still evolving and learning. So when possible, we do try to use a video connection because it does make things so much easier. So we tried as much as possible to use a video connection. It's also a lot of really understanding the key elements and the key risks, and asking for feedback back that, that they understand. So there is more active verbal, I think, confirmation, really on the onus on the researcher to make those efforts to assure understanding. And that's something that we had to learn to do. Like you said, you can't, if someone's on the phone with you, you can't watch for them to nod in understanding. So to really have more active. For our outpatient study, it was patients, if we didn't think they had an understanding, we would not proceed forward with enrolling them in the study. For our inpatient study, we were able to use legally authorized representatives. So if we initiated a conversation and kind of went through, the best you can, sort of a MacArthur without being face-to-face, and the participant was not able to pass that MacArthur assessment, we would then, try to convey as much of the research as possible, and ask them if it was okay if we could bring in their loved one. And sometimes it was very clear just from discussions with the research, with the clinical team, that the person did not have capacity to consent. So we would work with their legally authorized representatives. But yes, it takes a lot more active communication with the clinical team, with the participant or their LAR, to assure understanding of the research than it might be if you were more face-to-face.
Thanks, Abbey. There's one more here, Abbey, that I'm going to give to you as long as you're on the screen here. If a study is FDA regulated, there's a requirement for Part 11 compliance for eConsent. How has that affected the ability to obtain consent in this way?
Well, we are very fortunate at the U of M that our REDCap application has Part 11 compliance. So for research that goes through the U of M, we do have Part 11 compliance. And that is, and I don't want to sound like an expert on this at all, because I'm absolutely not an expert on this, but that is a mixture of process and the software. So the software is in place. Debbie, you could probably talk more at length about this, but the software is in place, and there's also a process that goes along with it. And we've gotten lots of guidance from the IRB as to how to set that up properly. But we do have Part 11 compliance here at the U.
Thanks, Abbey. Idly, we have one more question for you. From the language services community, what do you think has been the most challenging when providing interpretation for research that researchers should be aware of?
I think the most challenging is it's been, again, with the change to a mostly remote modality. I think that, again, even prior to any pandemic, connecting, again, for research purposes can be challenging and time consuming. The session, going over the information, there's so much documentation that takes place. And I think that's probably been one of the biggest challenge in providing this remote service, having to deal with that. And again, I think if nobody planned for a pandemic, but I think, again, if we would have perhaps done a lot more of that legwork, adapting learning and developing better resources for patients, I think it'll be easier to do the work. But I think it really is hard because, again, just face-to-face has been challenging because of the languages. Depending which language you're working with, there's limited resources in that language already. And then people are, again, defining even the concept of research can be very challenging to be able to find the equivalent in other languages. So I think that, again, the way I see this is just continuing to work together to be able to continue to improve and kind of learning from each other. Because I think from language services aspect, we really want to know as well from the research staff what's working and what's not working. And we've been having a great relationship here internally to be able to continue doing that work, but certainly open for more feedback and suggestions, because I think, again, it's just kind of developing that partnership and kind of feeding each other from what's working, what's not working, and how can we work together to improve that.
Thank you. So I think there's time for a very quick one more question for Harvey and Wrenda. Are any of the currently EUA approved vaccines considered better than the others?
Okay, it's a good question. Now I am a clinical pharmacist and Harvey is a pharmacist. So we do have obviously a lot of experience evaluating literature from a clinical perspective. I would say from a regulatory perspective, which is kind of what we're here to give you, they're all approved under an EUA. So they have all gone through the same process of evaluation, and the FDA has essentially issued EUAs for them equally. There are obviously fact sheets on all of them. And I would say it depends now from my clinical perspective. So this is not me giving a clinical opinion from a regulatory perspective. Me personally, clinically, depends on what you define as better. In terms of pure like efficacy with the original strains that were being tested, I would say the Pfizer and the Moderna ones show very, very similar efficacy rates. The Johnson & Johnson one is slightly decreased efficacy rates, and efficacy being, defined as symptomatic COVID transmission. So that does not encompass, there's a lot of things that aren't encompassed in what that means.
Wrenda, yeah, Wrenda, I'm really sorry to interrupt, but we're very close to
No, it's fine. It's a loaded question.
Yeah, it is.
I would say
I'm actually surprised that you answered it, but I but I appreciate that. And Harvey, I hope that if you have anything else that you think we need to know, you'll send me a note or something and I'll spread it around.
Yeah, I just, the only thing I wanted to say from a regulatory perspective is that all of those vaccines are going to have to go through the
right
regulatory approval process. And for all we know, one of the ones that are out there who have an EUA may never make it to the market. So time will tell.
So let's wait and see. Yeah.
Yep.
And they're constantly reevaluated. So they're constantly looking at real world data for all of them and updating everything.
Right. Well, I just want to say in 2 seconds here, thank you again to our really wonderful speakers. I think this has been really interesting, really great. So thank you so much. Thank you also to the audience for being engaged and for asking some really great questions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. DeBruyn to adjourn.
I just want to add my thanks. Thanks to everyone for being here. Thanks to the speakers for all their hard work and their thoughtful comments. And also thank you to HRPP for the wonderful partnership. I feel like we've had a solid partnership over a number of years, and I always appreciate it when we can work together to put on an event like this. So thanks to you all and have a good day.